Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar on ISO 2012-1 certification, the next step towards sustainable events. I'm Yilma, and the Marketing and Digital Content Specialist at MSCCB. I'm delighted that you have taken the time to join us today. Events often place a sustainable burden on resources, society, and the environment, creating substantial waste. In this webinar, we will explore the purpose and significance of this standard, a key factor in advancing event sustainability, boosting profitability, and enhancing your organization's reputation. To ensure we address all your questions, please submit them in the Q&A chat box. We will reserve some time at the end for the Q&A session, and for the questions that we cannot cover today, we will respond via email and include them on our website alongside with the recorded webinar. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our industry expert and ISO Management System Auditor, Graeme Parker, who will start with his presentation. Hello, Graeme.
Hi, thank you, Melina. Much appreciated, and thank you everybody who's took the time to come along to this session. So let me bring you sort of straight up to speed with what we're going to cover here. So starting off, we'll just cover off a little bit of the agenda, and then I'll introduce myself formally as well. So the idea behind today's webinar is to give everybody really a good overview of the ISO 2012-1 standard, and look at the principles of that standard and how that relates to the topic of event sustainability. We'll take a look at why sustainability in the event management business is particularly important and growing in importance and interest as well. And then we'll get into a little bit more detail around how we might incorporate sustainability as an idea into event planning and management, and also look at the audit side of the fence as well. So if your organization was to go through a certification audit for ISO 2012-1, what would that look like? What would the auditor focus on? And if you're organizing internal audits as well, what should that look like? So first of all, it might be worth introducing myself. So I'm Graeme Parker. As you may be able to pick up from the accent, I'm based in the UK, particularly in the north of England, near a city called York. My background is very much in the world of management systems. Actually, I come from an information and cybersecurity background by profession, but I have a very big interest in all things sustainability as well. And I've worked with multiple ISO standards through the years. And one of the roles I perform is I work with MSCCB as a management system auditor. And the relevance to this particular standard, I delivered one of the first MSCCB audits against ISO 2012-1 when we certified the Global Climate Action Summit back in 2018. So that's a little bit about who I am. But let me sort of delve into the content a little bit. And as we said, there will be opportunity to do questions and answers at the end here as well. So let's take a look at ISO 2012-1 as a standard and some of the principles behind ISO 2012-1. So what is it? Well, it is a management system standard, focuses specifically on event sustainability. So when we say a management system standard, many of you, I'm sure, on this webinar may be familiar with management systems such as ISO 9001 for quality, or 14001 for environmental management, 27001 for information security. So we know that a management system is a set of processes, activities, ways of working, if you like, that you embed into an organization to tackle a certain problem or to maintain a certain standard in a particular area. So ISO 2012-1 is no different. It's structured in a very, very similar way to those other standards. So its aim is to help event organizers establish processes, controls, and to implement, to measure the sustainability of events. And that might be for a single event or multiple events. So for example, if you're an event organizer and you organize many events, you could establish an ISO 2012-1 management system, which would allow you to apply sort of standardization, if you like, to the sustainability of your events. But equally, it is possible to purely apply the standard to one individual event as well. What ISO 20121 focuses on is a number of different sustainability principles, because often that word sustainability means different things to different people. So some people might think about sustainability as being to do with environmental matters, environmental pollution, carbon emissions and so forth, and climate change, etc. And you'd be absolutely right about that. But also sustainability focuses on other matters as well. Things like, how does your event affect biodiversity? How do we manage energy and waste from an event point of view? But also, as well as those sort of environmental matters, those energy management matters, ISO 20121 also gets us to focus on wider sustainability. So what's the economic impact of the events that we're running? The societal aspects. So, for example, are people in the local area where you're running your events kind of benefiting from this? Are underrepresented groups being considered? These are all matters of sustainability. So ISO's view on sustainability is that we can get to a position, if you like, where we can continue to deliver products, services and events, but in a manner that will stand the test of time, that will actually be repeatable and beneficial for many different parties. ISO 20121 within it has a number of required processes, which we'll examine very shortly, that not only will allow you to ensure that you're meeting certain sustainability targets, but allow the organisation implementing the standard to demonstrate sustainability of the event. So what you'll find within ISO 20121 is there are requirements, for example, to have measurements in some of these key areas we've just mentioned, the ability to produce metrics and reports, the ability to have some of your claims independently tested, are all ways in which we can actually demonstrate to one degree or another the sustainability of the events concerned. And of course, speaking at it as an auditor from a certification body, like many other ISO management system standards, event organisers can be independently certified against ISO 20121. And some of the benefits for an event organiser to do this, as well as obviously using the standard to actually achieve sustainability, which is the core aim, going through the certification process allows that independent verification from a third party. But also, once an organisation is certified, it is a way to demonstrate commitment to sustainability. And we certainly believe, and the market data I think would back this up, that there is a growing base of customers and people who genuinely do have sustainability concerns, and they're looking for organisations to respond and sort of demonstrate their credibility in this area. So that's what ISO, at a very, very high level, what ISO 20121 is about. Its aim and its target. So the question might be asked, okay, that's interesting, but what type of events is ISO 20121 intended to address? And the good news is it's an extremely flexible standard. And when I say flexible, that doesn't mean that we can pick and choose which parts of it we like or don't like. There are some mandatory requirements in there, but it's designed in such a way that it can be used by organisations of all shapes and sizes. It can be used for the most smallest event or very large your international events as well. And the point is, all events have potential impacts from a social, environment or economic perspective, all of which can be measured and managed under ISO 20121. But it's a particularly good standard, or I would even say excellent standard, for those organisations involved in organising multiple events. Because if your organisation is involved in organising multiple events, what you can do is you can build your framework, your management system, to ensure that each and every event that you organise follows a set of processes where we, for example, identify the sustainability requirements, the environmental impacts, the societal issues and so forth, that for each and every event we tackle those things in a consistent and repeatable manner. So for repeat event organisers, implementing this and then being able to be independently certified certainly can set a very strong tone and direction in this area. So let's think about some of the challenges then that this particular standard is designed to address. Like all other ISO standards, when ISO develop a standard that is based on a lot of research and understanding of challenges. So ISO is there to try and solve multiple problems. And we'll see that in a moment when we talk about the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. But within the standard, when you read through it, there is a section where we're asked to consider risks and opportunities. And before I go into what those are, as per laid out on the slide here, all events, of course, carry a level of risk. And by risk, we mean uncertainty. So risk management is about identifying uncertainty and trying to understand the impact that uncertainty might have. If something actually plays out in reality, how do we respond to that? But also, uncertainty doesn't necessarily need to lead to a negative event, because when we're planning an event, this might deliver certain opportunities as well, the opportunities to address different issues. So what issues are we specifically talking about here? So if we think about, there's three pillars, basically, to ISO 2012-1 and the concept of sustainability. That first pillar is the one we talked about a little bit earlier, environmental management. So if you think about any event, we are certainly going to use resources, whether that be power, water, human resources, so forth. We are going to use certain materials. Our event may well produce emissions of varying degrees. And depending on the type of event it is and where it's situated, it could potentially have an impact on nature and biodiversity. If we think about events that might release pollution into land or water or air. So one pillar of ISO 2012-1 is to take a look at, well, how do we reduce our impact on these things, but also how can we potentially make the right choices? So, for example, on one of the events I audited fairly recently, there's a very big focus on composting, for example, to reduce the risk of waste from single-use plastics. We also have, as well, to think about within the standard, what we call the social aspects of the event. So I'm sure we've all heard stories in the media and so forth about certain events, which I won't necessarily name here, possibly infringing on local communities, negatively affecting certain groups of people and so forth. So the focus here is making sure that we look at issues around things like labour standards. So the people we're employing to, whether it's to operate the event, build the venues, etc. Are we, providing them with the support that they need? Are we respecting health and safety requirements and legislation? And also engaging, as we see here, some of the issues here, local community, Indigenous rights, etc. Are we thinking carefully about the impact our event might have? And also how we ensure that we're being inclusive here to all those respective groups as well. And of course, whilst these are very important points, without a doubt, obviously an effective event isn't effective unless there's an economic return. Now, obviously, for a profit-making organisation, that might be about profit margins and so forth. But even for a non-profit, we still need to be able to run an event that does give a return on investment, that does give value back to those that are key stakeholders. So ISO 2012-1 does ask us to look at those economic issues as well, because something is only sustainable if it's economically viable going forward. So as you can see, it's a multi-pronged approach written in such a way that all organisations can really take involved in event management can take advantage of it. Now, one of the things I mentioned a moment ago was this thing called the Sustainable Development Goals. So you may be familiar with those already. So the Sustainable Development Goals are set by the United Nations, and there are a number of Sustainable Development Goals that ISO standards in particular have been designed to try and address. And interestingly, of ISO 2012-1, 11 of those 17 Sustainable Development Goals are being addressed. So when you look through these points here, and I won't necessarily read them out line by line, but you can see, whether it's health and well-being, whether it's reduced inequality, sustainable cities and communities. The standard is written in such a way that we can consider all of these areas and contribute to those SDGs as well. So for any organization that wants, there are many, and I know there are many out there that talk about their commitment to the SDGs, showing that by actually going through ISO 201, you can demonstrate how you meet many of them. So there's another positive aspect to this as well. So one thing that some of you might be wondering, of course, is that we know that there are other standards already out there that address various topics, in particular environmental management, when we think about ISO 14001. So the logical question might come up, well, why do we need ISO 2012-1 when there's all these other standards? And if we do adopt ISO 2012-1, how does that fit in with what we might already be doing? And that would be a very relevant question. So there are a couple of things to say here. So for those of you who've worked in management systems or with other management systems, you might be aware that back in 2015, when the ISO 9001 quality management system standard was updated, there was a sort of a drive within the ISO organization to standardize those management system standards. In other words, they are structured in the same way. Many of the sections are very similar and so forth. And that was a deliberate choice to try and allow organizations to build what we call integrated management systems. So let's say, for example, your organization has implemented an ISO 14001 environmental management system. Well, we don't need to then come along and do ISO 2012-1 separately. We can actually integrate the two together. A lot of the work you've done on building an EMS, an environmental management system, is completely compatible. In fact, by having ISO 14001, you've addressed one of the three pillars we were talking about a little bit earlier on. So they are designed to be integrated. So you could extend your EMS to include sustainable event management as well and become certified to both. Also, I know that some of your organizations, you might be using other non-ISO frameworks. A couple of them that are very popular at the moment are those from an organization called Planet Mark. So Planet Mark is a system where organizations can implement a series of processes and controls to reduce their impact from a climate change perspective. So it's very focused on that particular area. Or in the UK, we have this thing called the Certified B Corporations. A lot of large organizations following this particular standard that focuses on sustainability more holistically. But when you read those particular standards, they all allude to the fact that having an ISO management system is completely compatible. So we're not in any way suggesting let's adopt ISO 2012-1 as an alternative. We're actually saying it's part of your sustainability strategy. Why not, if you're an event-focused organization, let's introduce 2012-1 alongside and to complement some of those as well. So that tells us, again, at quite a high level, so you can have an entire day talking about the content of ISO 2012-1 and what it's all about, but that gives us at least a high-level view of what the standard is designed to do. So what I'd like to sort of continue on to say is, well, that's great, but what really is the importance specifically of event sustainability, and what are the benefits of thinking about event sustainability going forward? So let's make a sort of a few points here, and these words are not necessarily my own words. Actually, if you look at some of the guidance from ISO, I've kind of paraphrased a lot of things that I completely agree with that they've kind of said, and that is events of any shape or size, whether it's a major sporting event, music event, meetings, etc. Generally, they do have a heavy toll on resources. It takes us time and energy to get to those events from a transport point of view. We have resources that we use at the event. They take up potentially a lot of time. They potentially generate a lot of waste. This is kind of a well-known fact. And since the COVID-19 pandemic, we noticed obviously during lockdowns and so forth that we saw environmental changes to some degree during that time, but obviously the appetite, if you like, for physical in-person events in particular has grown. But there's kind of a realization, I think, from that many people saying, okay, well, how are we doing this time, but doing it better? So there's sort of a growing appetite, I think, to think more carefully about the impact of our events. And what we are also seeing, as I mentioned a little bit earlier on, is more and more, if you want to call them sustainability conscious people and customers, more and more people taking an interest in this issue. And even in areas where you wouldn't expect. If I think about the finance industry, for example, you look at financial investments today, a lot of financial investment organizations are asking questions of the companies that they're investing in, saying, show us, prove to us, under things like ESG, environmental social governance, how you are actually addressing some of these very deep concerns. And I can only see, as time goes on, and some of these issues perpetuate, that the demand and interest in this particular topic is going to grow. So what are the real benefits then of having effective event sustainability? And I think, first of all, that's something I'd like to just stress, that key word there, effective event sustainability. So we're not talking here about ticking a few boxes and looking like we're doing something well. We're actually talking about implementing a management system that really makes us think and deliver this effectively. And if we do, there are many benefits. Of course, I've been focusing on the event organisers. It's not just a benefit for the event organisers. There's the all key stakeholders, whether it's people who attend the event, whether it's people who are in the supply chain supporting that event, local communities, organisations. Let's think about some of the potential benefits of doing this well. We can aim to reduce some of those negative environmental impacts we've talked about before as much as we possibly can. We have the opportunity to think about how we might engage local communities and stakeholders and have a positive social impact. So do we create employment opportunities, training opportunities perhaps for people in those communities who may not have necessarily benefited in the past from these events? We also have the opportunity to increase efficiency in certain areas. If we think about reducing waste and energy use or improving that from a profitability and economic standpoint, which is the other pillar, we have the possibility to reduce costs and obviously have a financial return on investment. Of course, in many parts of the world, there are legal and regulatory requirements already in place about many of these topics, and I can only see that growing. But by having an effective management system in place, doing things effectively, you increase your likelihood of being able to fulfill those legal and regulatory obligations as well. Fifth one we've talked about already. If your organisation, especially as one of the early ones, the very first organisation to actually get certified to this standard was the Olympic Games in London in 2012. Having that mantle and being able to demonstrate the commitment obviously has a massive benefit from a reputational standpoint. And as we were saying earlier on, many organisations, particularly larger ones, but smaller ones as well, have ESG strategies now. But as I always say, an ESG strategy shouldn't just be a nice piece of paper or something to make people feel good. Actually, a good ESG strategy with positive reporting, with clarity, is beneficial for many organisations. As I've said already, there's a big focus of investors today, getting certified, implementing an effective management system and being able to show it contributes largely, I would argue, to this as well. So now we understand what ISO 20121 is and why we might want to consider adopting it and why we might want to consider sustainable event management. Let's just have a think a little bit about how we then incorporate sustainability into event planning and management. How do we turn that theory into some form of reality? So that's what I'm going to just try and elaborate on a little bit in this section here. So a sustainable event management system, or SEMS for short, is basically, as we said, part of a larger management system. And I know that some of you here will be management system experts, some of you might be new to the concept of management systems, but just to sort of reiterate that point, an event management, well, so start again, a management system in general, whatever the topic, is a way of an organization organizing itself through its organizational structure, through proper planning, defined roles and responsibilities, having procedures and processes in place that are established that allow a consistent delivery of something. So a quality management system would allow using all of these points as to repeatedly produce a product or service that meets minimum requirements. In our case, having a planned approach to organizing events could do the same thing. So as we've said, if your organization thinks from a management systems perspective, we can easily integrate this thinking into event planning and management going forward. So if you were to take ISO 2012-1 and follow it logically, if you go through essentially the clauses within the standard, the requirements, what does it actually tell us? Well, many of you might recognize this image on the slide here, what we call the plan, do, check, act cycle, or the Denning cycle, named after the Graeme Denning, the management consultant. And so what the standard says to us is, okay, look, first things first, let's think about who our key stakeholders are, the interested parties who may be affected by the particular type of events we organise. So what do I mean by interested parties? That could, of course, be the event organisers themselves, senior management, the people who attend events, your suppliers, the local community that's going to be present when in whatever part of the world that event is operating in. Other suppliers further down the chain, government organisations, NGOs, etc. All of these people you might say are interested parties. Your event could affect in a negative, positive way, but also these interested parties have, in most cases, an interest in what you're doing. So what we want to do is understand, or take the time to understand who those interested parties are, what their key concerns might be, what requirements essentially and expectations do I need to take forward. And with that knowledge, we can go through a logical approach. We can look at the three pillars. What is our event about? What's the scope of this event? What are some of the risks and opportunities in those three areas we talked about earlier? So environmental, societal, and economic. And then we can actually, based on our understanding of those risks, based on the understanding of those requirements, we can start to build some of our processes and approaches. But we don't just implement things and implement processes for managing sustainability and hope that they work. Of course, this is where management systems have a requirement within them to do a number of checks. So checks could be, for example, actually reporting and measuring statistics, so measuring our environmental impact, measuring the return on investment, but also having things which we'll talk about in the next section, like independent audits, so an independent set of ears and eyes to come and look at how well we're doing, and obviously to learn and act and improve. And what does that give us? Well, it doesn't give us necessarily a perfect event in all manners. There's debatable what we might say is a perfect event, but what it does give us is a management system that gives us a confidence that those events are managed in largely a sustainable way with evidence that we can provide to back that up. So let's think about building essentially a sustainable event management system. And I don't intend to go through the entire standard here, and I will be brief to some degree in this section. Obviously, you can read the standard yourselves, but I've kind of presented this based on the logical clauses in the standard. So where we usually start, and I've kind of alluded to it a little bit on that last slide, is before we can implement any kind of sustainable event management system, we need to understand our own organisation as an event planner, an event organiser, whatever it is we do. We need to understand some of the external issues that might affect us, laws, regulations, expectations. We need to think about how we're structured internally, how we operate. We need to understand who those interested parties are. And that would allow us, that information serves as a very good input to define the scope of our event management system. So by scope, I mean Are we building an event management system for certain types of events in certain parts of the world, or a one-off event, or is it for every event that we organise? These are some of the key questions hopefully we can answer with some credibility by doing some of that background work. And once we understand the context, we're only going to have a successful sustainable event management system implemented and working if we have support from what we would call top management, or what ISO would call top management. And top management means different things to different people. Often people think when we use the term top management, this means chief executives or C-level executives, and that may be true. In a huge global corporation, it might be local directors responsible for events in a particular area. But basically, the leadership we're talking about here are the people who have the authority and the resources to set the tone and direction. It's the people who set strategy, essentially. It's the people who can give us the time, the budget. It's the people who are authorized to commit, make policy commitments. Those are the kind of people we're talking about here. So what I want to make sure of is that before I embark on this journey, I've got the buy-in of my senior leadership, my senior management teams. And to get that buy-in, that could be a webinar in its own right about how we build business cases and show return on investment. But what I want to be able to explain to my top management is about some of the benefits we've just talked about. I want to be able to demonstrate why this is a significant investment. And if management are really committed, they're going to be there to provide resources. And I don't mean unlimited resources and no checkbook, obviously resources that are needed with a business case to back them up. But also, it's usually we find the most effective management systems are led by senior management who communicate and share and promote the values of this. If the rest of your organization, your stakeholders are seeing that your top management are committed, it's much more like people are going to get success and a following here. But even with that management commitment, we don't just then have a working, effective, sustainable event management system. There are things that we need to have in place. If we think about that plan, do, check, act cycle we just saw a moment ago, we need to, of course, take the time to understand for the events that we're organising the specific risks and opportunities. And we need to have a consistent way of assessing risk. And there are multiple risk assessment methods out there that we can refer to and use to do those risk assessments on a consistent basis. And again, just to be clear, this would not be just you or I independently doing a risk assessment. Obviously, those risk assessments have got to include some of those stakeholders. We've got to be consulting with the right audiences to understand the risk, so that we can decide which particular risks require some kind of treatment or need to be addressed. And throughout this, what we're also trying to do in the planning phase is lay out what are our objectives, tangible objectives. So are our objectives to reduce energy usage by a certain amount? Are they to provide a certain return on investment? Are they to support a certain number of the local community? Well, what is it we're aiming to achieve at the end? Because what we want to be able to show is we need to be clear what those objectives are, why those objectives are there, and later on, as we'll see in the next slide in a second, we want to be able to measure and show whether or not we're reaching those objectives. Is the management system working? And even with that good planning in place, obviously, to make that happen, to fulfill those objectives, there is a certain level of resources that we need, whether that's people to perform some of these actions, whether it's tools, technologies, budgets, etc. And of course, if I look at the middle two boxes down here, competence, the people who we rely on to implement this management system, to operate it, need to have the right skills, knowledge and awareness. So often there's a great opportunity for upskilling people here, giving people the competencies they need, perhaps creating opportunities that weren't there before. But across the board, even if, let's say I'm an individual, I work in your organization, I'm not necessarily directly involved in the event management system, I still would need as an individual to have a certain level of awareness about, what are your sustainability policies? What are the expectations of all of us involved in developing that event? And we need to make sure that all those stakeholders I've talked about earlier receive regular communication, two-way communication. I want stakeholders to be able to feedback as well. And some of this is going to, of course, be formally documented. So what we're saying is these are the pillars of a successful sustainable event management system. I can't expect to integrate this into the way our organisation works unless I've effectively got these things established and operating. Now, what we said is that a sustainable event management system isn't just about doing the things we've seen here. We want to validate whether or not the event management system is fulfilling the objectives we've just been talking about. So are we addressing the risks and opportunities we've identified? Are we achieving those objectives? So within the standard under clause 9, there's a number of different requirements, and they're all focused on checking how the plan do check exception. So things like monitoring our procedures. Are we seeing compliance with our policy and procedures? Are we seeing any incidents or concerns when it comes to these issues? Going out and seeking feedback from the key stakeholders who are involved. Measuring things like our environmental impacts, measuring financial return on investment using different metrics, as well as, we'll talk about it in the next section, conducting regular audits and learning from those audits, looking at the effectiveness of our risk treatment and getting our top management involved to perform regular management reviews. So these are all things that may well tell us that there are things that could be improved going forward, but that's a good thing. That's what this whole management system thinking is about, is to deliver that long-term sustainable improvement in the way we approach event management sustainability. And if we get that right, what we get, and you see this across the board in all management system standards from ISO, the opportunity to deliver continual improvement, whether that's better results in terms of economic returns, environmental impacts, societal returns. Over time, an organisation that has an effective management system will be able to demonstrate that slow, I won't use the word slow, but that steady, consistent and sustainable improvement. So before we go to the questions and answers, because I am conscious we've thrown a lot of information at you in a very short space of time, and there is one other topic on the agenda that is worthy of just a little bit of discussion, and that's about the audit side of the fence. So we've talked about what the standard is, benefits of sustainable event management, and some of the, I guess, things to think about when implementing ISO 2012-1. But like all ISO management systems, there's an audit aspect to it. And I just want to talk a little bit about audits and their role within ISO 2012-1 and the requirement for it and what it should look like. So again, I'm conscious we have many different people in the audience here with different backgrounds, but I thought it made sense to make sure we're all speaking the same language by kicking off and saying, well, what is an audit anyway? And rather than me making up my own definition for what an audit is, we have that very clearly defined in a guidance document from ISO called ISO 19011. It's actually entitled Guidance for Management System Audits. And we see the words here to say what an audit is. A systematic means it's planned and organised. Independent, so done by somebody who doesn't necessarily have a vested interest in the result. And documented process, and this is the interesting bit, to obtain audit evidence and to evaluate them to determine how much they meet the audit criteria. In English, what we're saying is an audit is about somebody independent looking at the requirements, looking at your objectives, looking at your policies, and then seeking out evidence to show whether or not those requirements have been fulfilled. That's what an audit is about. And identifying, if we're not fulfilling requirements, identifying that to allow us to learn and grow and develop. And very briefly, in the world of management systems, we have three types of audit. The one that is required within the standard, internal audit or first-party audit as we know it. So this is, let's say your organisation builds a sustainable event management system. You are going to organise audits of your management system so that you can get feedback and learn and grow and improve. A second-party audit might be very relevant because it's unlikely that you're going to be building events on your own. You're probably going to be working with suppliers and you might want to validate that your supplier is actually meeting the requirements you've laid out in contract, is actually living up to the expectations that you have, and therefore you might want to audit them, in which case we'd call that a second party audit. And when you invite a third party like MSCCB to come along and do an independent audit for certification, that's what we would call a third party audit. But the point here is, what I'm about to say could be applied to any of those, to first, second or third party audits, just some of the principles. And what I would say to you, if you're establishing a management system and you want that to be audited regularly, and if we look at internal audit, I would say whoever your internal auditors are, whether that's an internal audit department or a company that you hire to do those internal audits for you, it is a good idea to put together a clear audit charter. An audit charter sort of lays out the agreement and understanding of what audit is about. And I think it's important to have a clear definition of who's doing internal audit, what the purpose of that is, what the scope of that function is. But the big two for me are the bottom two that you see on this slide here. What authority does internal audit have to access the relevant information to do their job? And this does not mean that I'm saying that all internal auditors should be able to access all data on everything everywhere, but do they have a level of authority? And how have we got a confidence that those auditors are indeed independent? In other words, the opinion that they're giving is a fair, balanced one, based on evidence, without any pressure or benefit, if you like. And that's, if you look at the guidance in ISO 19011, that would help you very much in that case. And so those people conducting the audits, what we would suggest is that they should follow a set approach. So typically what we say on an audit is there are two steps in an audit. One is about trying to identify the evidence that's required to show whether a requirement is being met. And the other is about evaluating that evidence to say, okay, in terms of what I've read, in terms of who I've spoken to, in terms of what I've been physically seen and checked for myself, how confident am I as the auditor that requirements are being met? And that's where we have audit findings, and then ultimately a set of findings that give us a conclusion. Overall, do you align with the requirements of ISO 20211? Are you fulfilling your sustainable event management objectives? And what I would say about this is you want to ensure that whoever's conducting those audits has consistent procedures that they follow and a standardized approach. So you have a confidence that those audits are carried out in such a way that you can essentially trust the result and rely on the independent opinion of those auditors. Because ultimately, we want to make sure, as part of the management system, that there is an effective follow-up. And so I'll put all these bullet points on the screen here right now. So that essentially, when we find those opportunities for improvement, we can take those steps forward. So as part of a management system, an audit is not just a thing where we have a report on the shelf at the end, but we're learning from that. I always say, whenever implementing a management system, the auditors are my best friends, because ultimately they are a separate set of ears and eyes that might help me to see things I didn't see myself. Now, I am conscious a little bit of time here, so I will just cover a few points on here. So I'm putting lots of things up on the slide. So sorry about that. So just before we move to the Q&A, a logical question might be, okay, that's great, that's what audit is, but what specifically would an auditor focusing on event sustainability be examining and looking at? And these 9 areas are typically things that, to me, would be of specific interest. So I'd want to understand, before I go off exploring certain topics, I want to understand your events and specifically what risk assessment you've done. How did you, what risks and opportunities did you identify, and how did you go about doing that? And have you been rigorous in your thinking? Have you involved different stakeholders in your thinking? I'd want to see the policies that you have around this topic. Are they properly defined? Are they clear? Are they understood? I'd want to talk to a number of people in your organisation involved in establishing those events to understand their level of awareness when it comes to event sustainability. I remember doing one particular audit where we spoke to many different people, including those involved in catering. We were asking the chefs and the catering people about where they were sourcing food from and their food waste plans and so forth. And then after we've made sure you've engaged the right stakeholders, you've identified your risks, then we can get into the more technical discussions about energy management, waste management, food sourcing, how you're engaging with local communities or underrepresented groups. All of those factors are all important, but as an auditor, first thing I want to understand is the context, so we can frame those questions and aspects of the audit accordingly. So we've covered quite a lot of ground in that sort of 45 minutes or so, and being honest with you, for all of those particular things I've talked about there, I'm pretty confident there's an awful lot more that could be said. We could spend many hours on all of those topics, but we do have some limited time. So this is why we have a questions and answers session here. So I may come back to Mjelma to pick up some of the questions that hopefully some of you have been submitting as we've been talking there.
Yes, Graeme, thank you for your presentation. So we have gathered some questions, and the first one is, are there any case studies or best practices you can share to illustrate the success of this standard in reducing the environmental footprint of events?
We could talk about, so the standard's been around a little while. It's not been widely implemented, but yeah, we can certainly talk about a number of events that have completed. And I think one of the best examples I mentioned during the presentation was the London 2012, the Olympic Games. And there's certainly a lot of work done around, in that particular area, around renewable energy. The organising committee had also done some work within London to, for want of a better description, refurbish like a lot of the local housing. Had also done work on restoring some of the ecosystems. So essentially, a lot of the housing in the area is rebuilt with things like green roofs and so forth. They've done a lot of work to provide electrical charge points. So probably the Olympic Games, and 2012 was the first, and they have followed on the other Olympics since. So they're probably the best starting point, I would say, in terms of a real world case study where there's been direct proven impacts, I think, of this standard. Okay, thank you. The next one says, in what ways does this standard address waste reduction and management in event planning and execution? Can you share best practices for waste reduction in large events? Yeah, that's interesting. So the standard, remember what the standard has is those three pillars. So waste reduction arguably comes under both economic and environmental. So the standard doesn't necessarily say you must reduce waste by doing X, but there are a number of ways that that can be done. And I think back actually to that Global Climate Action Summit. So there's quite a few things that they did in that case. So there's a very big focus within that particular event on reusability. So things like single-use plastics were off the agenda. So what we try to do throughout that is make sure that anything that might use single-use plastic we removed where possible, or if something was to be disposed of, it was compostable. So that was one of the sort of key policies that they addressed. And the big thing they also did was around food waste as well. So you imagine an event like this, there was dinners and all kinds of events. They actually had an agreement with a local charity that at the end of each day, they would actually collect a lot of the food and spare meals and distribute those to homeless people in the area. So it's an example of where you're also engaging with the local community as well. So I think that's one way to tackle food waste. But yeah, essentially ensuring that anything that's single use is primarily reduced is, I think, one of the key factors in this particular area.
Okay, that's great. The last one for today, how do you address the challenges related to transportation and mobility, considering the impact of attendees traveling to and from events? Are there strategies for minimizing this impact? Yeah, this is probably one of the harder ones, and I know it's been very controversial, hasn't it? I mean, if we think about and again, I want to be careful what I say here, but if we think about, say,
recent World Cup last year. There was the Football World Cup. There was a big argument about that because the argument was, well, it's held in a very small country and therefore people don't commute very far. But the fact was everybody was essentially flying in from outside. So has that really reduced the transport burden? So I think there's a number of things we can certainly look at when we think about that Global Climate Action Summit. What they actually did there is they provided a number of electric vehicles essentially to collect delegates from the airport. They ran EVs to some of the local hotels, and those were offered free, or they were part of the cost of the event. So that was one way of kind of reducing the number of vehicles on the road, getting people onto the public transport. But the other thing they tried to do a lot of was carbon offsetting. And I know to some people that might sound a little controversial, but carbon offsetting is about trying to make estimates of impact. So what they did, for example, they identified the various parts of the world that people were traveling from, and including me as the auditor. So I had to explain my flights, etc. They would do essentially a carbon calculation from that. And then they had carbon offset projects. So in their case, this was about replanting trees, for example. They actually donated money to a charity to do rewilding, which doesn't stop the transport, but certainly reduces the impact. So certainly a level of offsetting, or also providing sustainable transport, or selecting a venue where sustainable transport is available. So thinking, are we operating in a place where people can cycle to the event or physically get there on foot? So a lot of it's in the planning, and reducing the need for people to travel huge distances, I think, would be a good thing to think about.
Okay, so thank you for all your answers and this great presentation, and for being with us today. We appreciate everyone signing in for this webinar, and for more updates, please check our MSCCB LinkedIn and Facebook accounts to stay informed about our next webinar. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.